Chapter 10. The Hatchers. "I can't believe it," said Specimen as they trudged home that afternoon. "We've been waiting 6 years to win this contest." "I know," said Jeremy glumly. He also knew that unless he was willing to face Mr. Kravitz, there was no way for either of them to enter. The idea was appalling. If he did confess, what was he going to say when Mr. Kravitz asked, as he was bound to, how Jeremy had done it? Honesty might be the best policy, thought Jeremy, but it's kind of tough when the truth is something no one will believe. Tiamat wheeled overhead, sending occasional messages of concern. She stayed with them the same way a puppy would, first sprinting ahead, then falling back to investigate something, circling around them, eager to play. Her antics made it hard to pay attention to Specimen. Why can't Spess see the dragon, thought Jeremy miserably, instead of Mary Lou? His thoughts were interrupted by a wave of gold washing through his head. Looking up, he saw Tiamat wheeling through the sky, looking like a string of rubies in the sunshine. Jeremy loved the sight, but it also troubled him. He had a feeling that dragons didn't really belong in this world anymore. Or did they? If Tiamat was invisible to almost everyone else, was it possible that there were other dragons, ones that he couldn't see? For a moment, the idea that the world might be filled with invisible wonders filled his head. Who knew how many amazing things were out there, unknown, waiting to be discovered? "What you looking at?" asked Specimen. "Just thinking," said Jeremy. "You've been doing a lot of that lately. Want to come in and have something to eat?" Before Jeremy could answer, Specimen smacked himself in the head. He said, "I've got something that belongs to you." "What?" "A book. I accidentally brought it home with some of my art stuff that day I got mad at you. It looks good if you like that kind of stuff." "What book?" asked Jeremy, hardly daring to hope. Specimen shrugged. "Something about disappearing dragons." Jeremy couldn't believe it. Miss Priest's book had been here all along. He didn't know whether to shout with relief or clobber Specimen for causing him so much worry. "I can't really stay," he said, which was more than true, considering the fact that he had a loose dragon to keep an eye on. "But I need that book." Specimen looked hurt. Jeremy continued home, clutching Miss Priest's book to his chest. He couldn't believe it had been in Specimen's room all this time. He couldn't wait to get home and read it. A few blocks past Specimen's house, he heard a yowl from the bushes beside him. He paused. The yowl came again. It sounded like a cat in pain. Plunging through the leaves, Jeremy cried out in shock. There under the tree was Fat Pete. His legs had been tied together, front leg to front leg, back leg to back leg, and he was hopping about trying to escape his tormentor, Freddy the Frog Killer, who was poking at him with a stick and laughing hysterically. "You stop that!" cried Jeremy. Freddy turned around. His cheeks were red, and Jeremy could tell he was angry at being caught in his nasty game. "Who's gonna make me?" he snarled. "Just stop it," said Jeremy, painfully aware that he was too small to make Freddy do anything. To his amazement, Freddy did stop. "You're such a jerk, Thatcher," he sneered. Throwing down the stick, he brushed past Jeremy toward the sidewalk. Jeremy held his breath until Freddy was past him. He was just about to breathe out when a ferocious kick caught him in the rear and sent him sprawling face first into the dirt. "A jerk," repeated Freddy. "Also, He didn't have time to finish explaining what Jeremy was because Tiamat attacked. It would have worked better if Freddy had been able to see her. Then her claws, her jaws, her very strangeness might have frightened him into backing away. As it was, he only felt something unknown land on his chest and start to claw at him. Screaming, he flailed his arms in front of him. The frantic action knocked the little dragon into a bush. Red swirls of pain streamed through Jeremy's brain. "Tiamat!" he cried in horror. Freddy's face was white. "You're weird, Thatcher!" he screamed just before he turned and ran. Jeremy groaned and pushed himself to his feet. Fat Pete howled, but Jeremy walked past him. Except for his dignity, the bound cat was unharmed. Tiamat, however, was caught in the branches of a thorny bush, and her struggles to escape were only making the situation worse. "Stop," thought Jeremy. "Let me help you." Tiamat panted with exertion, her hot breath withering the leaves around her. Stop, thought Jeremy again. You're going to hurt yourself. She slowed her struggles. Working carefully, Jeremy extracted her from the bush. Though the thorns had scraped her wings, they were leathery and too tough to be easily pierced. Nasty, she thought, sending pictures of both Freddie and the bush. Jeremy couldn't have agreed more. With Tiamat perched on his shoulder, he untied Pete, who scratched him for his efforts. Jeremy felt a blaze of anger. Immediately, Tiamat tensed her legs as if to launch herself at the cat. No, he thought. Tiamat sent her question feeling. He tried to explain that Pete was just lashing out because he was angry. He wasn't sure he got the point across, but it gave Pete time to get away. Jeremy picked up his books. Still smarting from Freddie's kick, he pushed his way out of the bushes and limped home. Rather than going into the house, Jeremy headed for his father's office. Hold still, he thought to Tiamat. I want to get something to put on your wings. The dragon sent back a message of agreement. Dr. Thatcher whistled when his son walked through the door. What happened to you? He asked. You look like you've been dancing with Fat Pete. Jeremy blinked in astonishment. Could his father possibly know what had just happened? What do you mean? He asked nervously. Those scratches, said Dr. Thatcher. I hope Mary Lou didn't do that to you. Jeremy put his hand to his cheek. He'd been so worried about Tiamat and Fat Pete that he hadn't noticed what had happened to his own face when he fell. Do you want some ointment for... Dr. Thatcher's voice trailed off. He looked at Jeremy and blinked. Dad? Dr. Thatcher shook his head. I've been working too hard, he said, rubbing a hand across his eyes. Jeremy sighed. For a moment he thought his father had started to see Tiamat. Life would be so much easier if he knew about her. For a moment he considered trying to tell his father, but he remembered Mr. Elev's letter. By accepting the dragon, he had accepted a vow of secrecy. Let me get those cleaned up, said Dr. Thatcher, pointing to the scratches on Jeremy's face. Then I want to put some ointment on them. Only don't tell your mother. She doesn't like it when I use animal medicine on you, even if it is perfectly good. Jeremy sighed. One more secret to keep. Is this stuff good for any animal? He asked as his father smeared the salve on his scratches. All-purpose antiseptic, said Dr. Thatcher. Guaranteed to zap germs before they can get a foothold. Can I have some extra? Asked Jeremy. Dr. Thatcher hesitated. Sure, he said, staring again at the place where Tiamat perched on Jeremy's shoulder. He closed his eyes and then opened them. Take all you want. When he entered the house, Jeremy found a letter waiting for him on the dining room table. The spidery handwriting on the envelope was the same as that on the magic shop's direction sheet. He waited until he had smoothed salve over Tiamat's wings. Then, feeling nervous, he opened the envelope. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the crisp paper. The words it held were both a relief and the worst thing he could possibly imagine. Thatcher, it will soon be time for the dragon to go home. Come to the corner of Main and Not Main at 11:30 on Midsummer Night. Bring the dragon, as well as any teeth it has lost, any skins it has shed, and whatever bits of eggshell you are able to save. Be prompt. S.H. Elves. Jeremy stared at the note in distress. He had always guessed that Tiamat would have to go home sooner or later. Part of him had even been eager for that to happen. Certainly life would be simpler without a dragon to care for. But another part of him had hidden from the idea. He had never really prepared himself to cope with the thought of her leaving. He had let himself grow used to her sendings, her questions, her constant presence in his head. Now the very thought of losing her made a great wave of loneliness well within him. As it did, he found his head filled with an image of dragons, hundreds of dragons, flying through a darkened sky. Home, sang a feeling inside him. He blinked and the image vanished. Jeremy looked at Tiamat. Home, she repeated. Not in words, of course, but by sending him a feeling which could mean nothing else. Late that night, Jeremy was tiptoeing up the stairs with some chicken livers for Tiamat. Suddenly his mother stepped into the hallway, tightening the belt on her robe. She looked at the plate in his hand and said, What are you doing? I'm doing an experiment. You know how feeding meat to an animal compares with just giving it pellets and stuff? Mrs. Thatcher closed her eyes. You're trying to create killer gerbils? Does your father know about this? Jeremy shook his head. Well, check with him. He's been wondering where his chicken livers have been going. I don't think he'll be too happy to find out you're using them to play mad scientist. I'll talk to him about it tomorrow, promised Jeremy. Mrs. Thatcher nodded, then walked into the bathroom. Jeremy waited until she had closed the door, then dashed for his own room. He found Tiamat crouched in the middle of the floor, trying to breathe flame. Stop that, thought Jeremy as he put the livers in front of her. You'll scorch the floor. I want to make fire, thought Tiamat as she started to gobble the livers. Do you think you could cut back on those? Asked Jeremy. I think I'm going to have to start buying them out of my allowance. Tiamat sent an image of a plate full of gerbils lying on their backs, their little paws stiff above them. Forget it, said Jeremy. I'll buy the chicken livers. A red and gold sigh trickled through his head as the dragon returned her attention to her meal. The next morning, Jeremy found Tiamat sitting on his desk, preening her burnished scales. Lying beside her was another discarded skin. Her tail, which hung over the edge of the desk, reached nearly to the floor. Jeremy rolled the crinkly red skin and put it with the others. As he did, he wondered again how big she was going to get. Big, replied Tiamat cheerfully. Too big for this room, thought Jeremy, stroking her head, which was now wider than his fist and longer than his foot. In fact, if she continued to grow at this rate, it wouldn't be long before she would no longer fit through the door. He wished he could get a little of that growing ability for himself. What am I going to do with you? He thought. Tiamat curved her neck around his arm. Send me home, she replied, in a combination of pictures and feelings. Jeremy's stomach tightened. When he had gone to bed last night, he had considered ignoring the summons that had come from the magic shop. When Midsummer Night, whatever that was, came, he would just stay right here with Tiamat. The idea had been a little frightening, but not as frightening as losing the dragon. But if she wanted to go, well, that was different. He couldn't keep her here against her will. A wave of sadness, muddy green and dark brown, rolled through him. He understood. Tiamat didn't want to go, not entirely, but she knew she had to. But where? Where was home? Well, he knew one place where he might find an answer. Miss Priest's book. He could sense Tiamat's approval when he took it to his desk and began to read. Listen to this, he said after a while. Tiamat closed her eyes and listened while he read from the book. The time came when this world was no longer safe for dragons. Earth had too many heroes, too many swords, and not enough magic. One by one, the great dragons were being slaughtered. In an attempt to save the last dragons, the wizard Bellenmore opened a door between the worlds. Through this gate, the remaining dragons passed to the new world that was to be their home. It was a harsh world, but it was a world without men, and therefore safer for dragons. Yet, as things turned out, there was still a problem. Suited as this world was to the great beasts, it was unfit for their eggs. Though many eggs were laid, for over 100 years not one new egg hatched. Dragons lived for a tremendous time, of course, but during the 2nd century of this blight, they began to fear that their kind would become extinct after all. Finally, the dragons contacted Bellemore's successor, Aaron the Wise, later known as Aaron Dragonfriend, and requested his aid. Aaron brought a dragon's egg home with him to see if it could be hatched here in this world, where dragons had once lived. He discovered that without our moon to quicken it, a dragon's egg remains dormant forever. With this knowledge, he was able to hatch the egg. Later, when the dragon had grown too large to stay here safely, Aaron faced great peril to send it back to the rest of its kind. This was the beginning of the company of hatchers. Since that first hatching, a handful of eggs had come to this world each decade. Each egg is held out of sight of the moon until the right person appears. Then the egg is entrusted to the hatcher, who must guard the young dragon, and when the time is right, help it go home. Jeremy closed the book and sighed. It looked like he had better find out about Midsummer Night.